This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news, recorded just after midnight GMT on Thursday the 4th of September. I'm Nick Miles with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, we hear from the secret team investigating Islamic State members for possible war crimes trials.
This is more of a criminal franchise than a religious one. A lot of the IS within Syria have a very poor grasp of Islam.
President Obama wants a regional strategy to combat Islamic State. The US former ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, tells us what that strategy should look like.
I don't think it's ever wise to rule out options. I don't want to say that we need ground troops, but I also wouldn't want to say that we would never do it.
Also in this podcast, blueprint for a ceasefire? Russia calls on rebels in eastern Ukraine to stop fighting and Kiev to pull back troops. A Pakistani-British woman tells us how it's not only white girls who've been victims of these sexual abuse scandals involving men of Pakistani origin.
I was abused by a neighbour when I was a child. I didn't say anything about it because there's these huge cultural issues around shame for victims.
And the dirty linen of France's former first couple, now thoroughly aired in public. But we begin in the Middle East with Islamic State, the extremist militant group fighting to carve out a new Muslim caliphate, stretching from Iraq to Syria and the Mediterranean. IS has now claimed responsibility for murdering two American journalists, Stephen Sotloff and James Foley. President Obama has vowed to bring their killers to justice, and he specifically used that word, justice. Of course, that word is open to interpretation. It could mean simply bombing the group into oblivion. But justice in the form of possible war crimes trials is on the agenda. It's emerged that a team of investigators, paid for by the British government, is gathering evidence for use in future court cases. Frank Gardner secured exclusive access to the team's work. He told James Menendez more.
Well, this has been a complete surprise to me, as I think it has been to most of our audience, that unknown to the public, for the whole of this year, there has been this secret team funded by the British government working out of a European city to build up prosecution-ready files on the senior leadership of Islamic State, previously known as ISIS. And the kind of people that they're going after are not necessarily the foot soldiers, the actual people wielding the knife in these horrible snuff videos. It's actually the senior commanders, the emirs, the provincial governors, the people giving the orders. And it's all down to something that they call command responsibility, that if they can prove there is a chain of command coming from the top down, then the people who are giving those orders or sitting at the top of the chain are responsible. Of course, it's not easy to get them to trial, but you first of all got to prove that there is a crime and that they are linked to that crime. And that's what they're doing through a series of investigations. They're running sources inside Syria, some of them at extreme personal risk to themselves. They're building up a very elaborate picture of the whole structure of Islamic State. It's far bigger and more elaborate than they thought. They've got this 1+4 structure where you've got the caliph and 4 councils, shura, sharia, military and security, and that's replicated all the way down to local level. Different nationalities are given different roles. For example, the Tunisians and the Chechens are said to be the most aggressive and belligerent fighters, often quite sadistic, and they are put into very much fighting foot units, whereas the Britons tend to turn up, we're told, without any battlefield experience, so they tend to get given rather menial back-office tasks.
In the interview we're about to hear, who are you talking to?
The person that we interviewed was by Skype, and he is one of the people involved in the forward teams. He wouldn't actually tell us which country he's in, but he's one of the people who is running what's called their sub-sources. Even though they're funded by the British government, they were adamant that they are not an intelligence agency. They are an international independent organisation. These are not amateurs. These are people with extensive experience in war crimes, investigations and prosecutions. So we spoke to him to get an idea of what kind of jobs are assigned to what kind of people who turn up volunteering to fight with Islamic State.
By and large, the Westerners are given menial or low-level tasking by the emirs, and some of those roles, for example, might include static security guarding or looking after the provision of food for the fighters.
Why is that? Is it because other nations like Saudis or whatever, or Iraqis tend to have more military experience?
I think that definitely plays a role. I believe that there's been an experience by the IS of Westerners coming to Syria having no discernible skills within the battlefield to provide to the IS. And so there's been this evolution whereby when a Westerner arrives, there's an assumption that they're better off providing ancillary services to the group because they're unlikely to hold either the religious or military expertise that the IS is looking for.
Do you have any sense that there is a kind of a grand strategy with IS, or are they just being opportunistic, taking ground when they can?
The IS has an overarching strategy, but it devolves by and large its decision-making to local emirs. And with that in mind, the group is moving more tactically than strategically on a day-to-day basis. It struggles to link in between Syria and Iraq. The leadership in Iraq provides broad strategy, but most of the decision-making is devolved to the local emirs.
What happens when volunteers, jihadists, come from Europe, from the West, they cross over the border from Turkey into Syria, and once they are collected by Islamic State people on the Syrian side of the border, what happens then?
Immediately, their identification is removed from them. They are given a kunya, if they don't already have one.
That's a nickname, a kind of a nom de guerre.
With them. And their passports and any other documentation is removed to another location. They're unlikely actually to get that documentation back. And then they move into religious indoctrination almost immediately, followed up by some basic military training. It's also worth noting that marriage is used as a strategy by the IS. So they will offer Syrian women as brides for the foreigners coming into fight.
Are there proven cases of that?
There are absolutely cases whereby Syrian women are volunteering to marry IS fighters, and that is actually a well-known strategy by the IS to draw not just Syrians but also foreigners to fight with them. One of the important points is that this is more of a criminal franchise than a religious one. A lot of the IS adherents within Syria, including the emirs, have a very poor grasp of Islam. In a lot of the cases, we see criminal warlords rising up through the IS ranks and enforcing their criminal prowess in these local areas.
Talking to your subsources, do you get any sense that people are in areas ruled by IS, are they chafing under it, or are they just accepting it, that this is how life is going to be now?
In a lot of cases, there is an immediate honeymoon period because the pressing issues of security, safety, food, water are met immediately by the IS when they arrive. I believe the longer the IS stays, the more the local populace rails against the IS's vision of the caliphate. The longer the IS stays in Syria, the more likelihood we'll see an awakenings-type movement, similar to which we saw in Iraq against al-Qaeda.
So how long will this process take, Frank? I mean, what happens when they're done gathering this evidence?
Well, it's an open-ended task because Islamic State is getting bigger by the day. It's huge. I asked them how big they thought it was. They said, look, back in May, we'd have put the figures at about 10,000. Now we'd say it's triple that. Since they declared a caliphate and swept across northern Iraq, it's pulled in a lot of volunteers from all over the Middle East and Europe. So they've got a lot more work to do. But they say that by the end of this year, they expect to have the first prosecution-ready files completed. The problem is that there is no court that can try them.
What the investigator told you, I mean, it does sound a lot like what the British and American governments have been saying, that Islamic State is a criminal gang and these Western fighters from Europe and elsewhere get the low-grade jobs but still pose a threat if and when they choose to return. I mean, did you ever feel at any point that this was the UK authorities in whatever capacity, putting their version of events forward, feeding the BBC a line, if you like?
Well, it's a very fair question to ask. In fact, we got quite the opposite impression from them, providing they're telling us the truth and we've no reason to disbelieve them, that actually the UK government is absurdly hands-off. They're not giving them any deadlines, tasks or demands. They're simply funding them to the tune of $70,000 a month and letting them get on with it. And they're saying, actually, we'd quite like it if they took a bit more interest in us. We're working hard on this stuff. We'd actually appreciate a bit more interest from them.
Frank Gardner, our security correspondent. Well, let's hear a bit more of what President Obama had to say about the administration's plans to deal with Islamic State.
Our objective is clear, and that is to degrade and destroy ISIL so that it's no longer a threat, not just to Iraq, but also to the region and to the United States. But now, what we need to do is make sure that we've got the regional strategy in place that can support an ongoing effort, not just in the air, but on the ground, to move that forward.
So, President Obama wants to build a regional coalition to counter IS, but there were no more details. Kurt Volker was America's ambassador to NATO. What did he think the president's strategy might be? James Menendez asked him.
Well, I don't think the president has really fleshed out a strategy yet. As he said in his press conference the other day, the administration is working on it.
Well, he said he had no strategy.
Well, he said that. He said that. But I think clearly the administration is trying to put one together. I think that it needs to start with a clear goal. And if you heard the press conference in Estonia today, there wasn't really a clear goal. Was it the degradation of ISIS? Was it the destruction of ISIS? So we need to have a clear goal. And I think the goal is going to have to be to destroy ISIS. The next thing then is to then rally countries to support that goal, because the U.S. alone is not going to be able to do this. We're going to need the support of Sunni governments in the broader Middle East region. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Turkey. We're going to need the Kurds. And we're going to have to work with the Iraqi government, which, of course, is run predominantly by Shia at this point. But we can't line up only with the Iraqi government and by default then with Iran, because that would inflame a Shia-Sunni divide where it might actually rally Sunnis to ISIS. And we need to make sure that we are working with the moderate Sunni leadership in the region in order to crack down on this really unacceptable organization that has just these brutal levels of violence. Then on top of that, with a regional coalition, you may need some European allies to pitch in and help. And you will also need U.S. military force directly engaged and a commitment to that so that people in the region have something that they can have some faith in, that it's not just going to be talk or a few countries and it all fizzles, that we're going to have some serious military force against this group.
And when we're talking about military force, I mean, mainly airstrikes, is that what it's likely to be?
Well, I would start with airstrikes, and I would also start with arming and supporting the Kurds, the Iraqi government, the Free Syrian Army, and working with others, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, to see what they are able to bring to the fight. I don't think it's ever wise to rule out options. I don't want to say that we need ground troops, but I also wouldn't want to say that we would never do it, because we just don't know how things are going to evolve. We need to set the right goal, set the right strategy, find the right allies, and then pursue it till it's over.
Do you think there is a military solution? I mean, is that the way? It has to be that way.
Of course. This is something that I think people are lazy when they say, oh, there's no military solution. You hear this almost 3 times a day in Europe. There's never a military solution to anything. Well, that's just wrong. Whether it's in Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is fighting against the Ukrainians, or whether it's ISIS fighting in Iraq, there is already a military conflict going on. People are fighting, and there will be a military solution of some kind. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, what will that military solution look like? Do we care about it, and how can we influence it?
Kurt Volker. Well, a solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, referred to there, has been announced by President Vladimir Putin. He's unveiled his own peace plan. Here's just a bit of what he had to say.
In order to stop the bloodshed and stabilize the situation in southeast Ukraine, I believe that the parties to the conflict shall agree and implement the following steps in a coordinated manner. First, cease active offensive operations by the armed forces and armed formations of the militia of southeast Ukraine in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas.
NATO's Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, speaking on the eve of his organisation's summit in Wales, didn't have much faith in that plan.
I think the bottom line is that the Russians are not sincerely interested in a ceasefire. They continue to destabilize eastern Ukraine. I don't think there is an imminent threat towards any NATO ally, because our determination is so strong. And the Russians know that if they were to cross that red line, we would respond determinedly.
I've been speaking to our correspondent in Moscow, Steve Rosenberg, and David Stern, who's in Kiev. I began by asking Steve to tell me more about this new Russian proposal.
Well, this was a 7-point peace plan that Vladimir Putin said he scribbled down on a piece of paper on an aeroplane when he was flying to Mongolia today. Some of the other points, there would be international observers on the ground in a security zone. There would be a prisoner exchange. There's been quite a mixed reaction to the plan, though, I have to say, in Kiev. On the one hand, President Poroshenko has spoken quite positively about it. He's welcomed what appears to be the start of a peace process. But the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, has denounced it, and he said that Russia's real plan is the destruction of Ukraine and the resurrection of the USSR.
Absolutely. We'll be getting more from Kiev on that in a moment. But why do you think President Putin has proposed it now? Of course, the NATO meeting in Wales, is there a timing issue there?
Yeah, possibly. I think that Vladimir Putin feels very confident. He feels he's in the driving seat here. In recent days, Ukrainian forces have suffered setbacks. And I think that he believes that although there's strong words coming from President Obama criticising Russia, scathing criticism of Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin knows very well that the West doesn't want to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. NATO doesn't want a war. The United States doesn't want a war. And that gives Vladimir Putin a lot of power, really, to dictate any negotiation on his doorstep.
Steve, stay on the line. We're going to go to Kiev now, where our correspondent David Stern's standing by. David, you heard there that Steve was outlining what reaction there had been in Kiev to this. Whose voice do you think is stronger? The president, who said he hoped negotiations would begin on Friday, he seemed quite upbeat, or the Prime Minister there, Mr. Yatsenyuk, who was very downbeat about it?
Well, I guess we'll find out. The peace process is supposed to start anew, or at least discussions on Friday in Minsk. Mr. Yatsenyuk expressed a feeling, I think, of a lot of people here in Ukraine not to trust Vladimir Putin. He also said that this was happening because the EU is threatening sanctions on Friday. And he said that, as Steve pointed out, that he's trying to reinstate the Soviet Union. But Mr. Poroshenko has also got a position, I guess, that could possibly be supported by the public because people are very frightened. They say their country's being invaded, and the evidence definitely is growing that points that way or suggests that. And they're also horrified at the killing. The reports of the casualties are becoming greater and greater, and I think people are beginning to realize that this could turn into, as the defense minister said, a war that costs tens of thousands of lives.
David Stern, and before him, Steve Rosenberg. You're listening to Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And if you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. And you can also post a message on the BBC World Service Facebook page, facebook.com/BBC World Service. One of the big stories of the last few days here in the UK has been a devastating report into the sexual abuse of young white girls by men of mostly South Asian origin in one town in northern England. It made for horrific reading, not just because of the systematic nature of the abuse by organised groups preying on vulnerable girls, but also because so little was done to stop it happening. And it's not just Rotherham. There have been similar cases in other towns and cities around the UK. And again, the majority of the offenders have been British Pakistanis. But what about the victims? Well, some fear the understandable outrage has obscured the fact that there are many other victims from within that same community. Rizwana Bashir grew up in northern England in a small, close-knit community of a few hundred British Pakistanis. She told James Menendez her story.
I was born and raised in a small British Pakistani community in Yorkshire. It wasn't too far from Rotherham, about 60 miles, and I was abused by a neighbour when I was a child. I didn't say anything about it because there's these huge cultural issues around shame for victims of this kind of abuse, and in the end, often victims end up being blamed, they're accused of being liars, and there's ostracization of their family, and the whole community at large tends to alienate those that come forward. And so I didn't say anything at the time. I ended up leaving to go to university and ended up building my career in London and then in America. And about a decade later, I brought a court case against my abuser. Another person in the community ended up joining me in that court case. He had been abused about 20 years before I was, and we got a conviction with an 8-year jail sentence. But the community through the whole process was deeply unsupportive, and we were assumed to be liars, and our families were shunned.
And is that something, just to be clear, is that something particular to the sort of community, a British Pakistani community that you grew up in, do you think?
I think it reflects many of the British Pakistani communities in the UK, which are often pretty deprived. There are low levels of education, and they're very, very patriarchal, and that often leads to a lot of misogyny. And so within those kind of contexts, it's not for every British Pakistani does not feel this way, but in the context of these communities where often the people who are kind of self-appointed leaders moved to the UK 30 or 40 years ago and really haven't evolved any of their views when it comes to gender and these kind of issues, for them actually that's a continued problem. And what's happening is that there are perpetrators that are not being outed by the community because they're brushing it under the carpet because it has this huge issue of shame associated with it.
And in your case, do you think everybody in your community knew about this abuser? Or at least most people?
So many people in the community were aware that there were rumours going around about the fact that this man was an abuser. The person who testified with me had come forward about 10 years earlier and attempted to have the community react to this and say, look, this man has abused me and shouldn't be allowed to be around children. And the whole community just brushed it under the carpet. He wasn't supported by his family.
Why couldn't you tell your parents at the time?
It wasn't something that it would have reflected upon me. It wasn't something that I felt I could. I was very paralyzed by the shame of it, and so I didn't tell anyone. You might say your parents. I didn't tell a single soul until I was in my 20s.
At the time of the abuse, I think you were 10. I mean, didn't you feel an instinctive need to tell your mother, for example?
I mean, it's very, very challenging to tell anyone when you're in this cultural context, because you know that there's a huge amount of shame in what's going on, and that you're not in a position to tell anyone. Yes, do I wish I had the courage? But even if I had it, the challenge is that it probably wouldn't have gone anywhere. Many other parents, do find out about this. One of the people who was abused, his parents did know, but they did nothing about it. So even if I had come forward at the age of 10, the sad fact is that it probably would have been brushed under the carpet even then.
By your own family. I mean, that's a terrible thing to know. I mean, you did tell your mother later, after you'd left Northern England. What was her reaction then?
I mean, I think it's this similar thing, which is she knew that the family was going to be ostracized. She knew that it was going to bring huge amounts of shame to the family. She knew that she and my siblings and my father would be shunned by the community. They'd be alienated. And so that was something that she didn't want. My family was the same as many other families would probably be, and if they were faced with this situation. And that's part of the reason that I'm really trying to shed light on this issue, is because this victim shaming and blaming that goes on in the British Pakistani community has to end. When I read all of the cases in Rotherham, I was deeply upset, like many, about the incredibly horrible cases that we were reading about. And the thing that really scared me about it was that this huge underreporting of abuse from Asian victims. And so even though there were girls that were being targeted by these same gangs and these older men outside their school gates, and even though there are, Muslim girls that have been prostituted and brutally raped and had some of the kind of brutal experiences that we've read about with Rotherham, they were, raped, beaten, had burnt with cigarettes, all of these horrific experiences that were happening to Muslim women as well, they haven't really come forward, and that's because of this incredible issue of shame.
Rizwana Bashir. A story or a relationship eroded by jealousy and power, a story of love and despair. That's how a new book by former French First Lady Valérie Trierweiler is being described. Called Merci pour ce moment, it describes her relationship with French President François Hollande. Valérie Trierweiler lived with the president at the Élysée for a year and a half, and then a magazine exposed his relationship with actress Julie Gaillet. Valerie was hospitalised, reportedly in a state of shock. Now, extracts of the book are now being published in Paris Match, where she's a journalist.
The information on Julie Gaillet is the top headline in the morning papers. I crack up. I don't want to hear that. I rush in the bathroom. I grab the little plastic bag with the sleeping pills. Francois follows me. He tries to snatch the bag. The pills spill over the bed and on the ground. I swallow what I can. I want to sleep. I don't want to leave through the coming hours. I feel the storm about to break over me, and I don't have the strength to resist. I want to flee. I lose consciousness.
Valerie herself met Francois Hollande when he was in a long-term relationship with fellow politician Ségolène Royal, the mother of his children. French journalist Colombe Pringle gave her reaction to the book.
Well, first of all, it's a sort of coup, because everybody was talking about an eventual book that she would write. Some were saying that she got some money not to write. It's a woman that's been extremely humiliated the way she was fired, because this is what happened, who's been wounded like an animal and who's licking her wound, but unfortunately it's not going to help her. Maybe everybody's going to just get on it like animals on a dead body, and then maybe they'll be disgusted because there's something in it that could be rather vulgar. It's really in the gutter.
Emma Jane Kirby has more on the political fallout for Francois Hollande.
Paris Match says the book is going to send shockwaves through the Élysée. The president's press team said yesterday they had no idea it was being written, let alone published. The problem for Francois Hollande, of course, is that his approval ratings are already at a record low. Just 17% of French people think he's doing a good job. So I asked Philippe Labro, the political anchor for the TV channel D8, whether the book would be damaging to the French president.
Francois Hollande is already quite damaged without the book. The economy is not good. The government of Mr. Valls is having trouble with his left wing. So if you add this book, which reveals a rather severe aspect of his character, it's not good. I mean, he comes out as cold-hearted, cynical, calculating, rather different from what the average Frenchman thought of him when they elected him. It will be another cloud above his head, which is already very clouded.
And perhaps the most damaging thing in the book, remember how Hollande was elected to break with that bling-bling image of President Sarkozy, how he said he hated wealth? Well, in her book, Madame Treweiler recounts a family dinner where President Hollande is said to mock the working-class origins of her family. He makes out, she writes, that he doesn't like the rich, when in fact this man of the left hates the poor.
Emma Jane Kirby. Over the last 20 years, the number of miners in Spain has fallen from 45,000 to just over 3,000, and it's set to fall further. The European Union says state subsidies to mining should end by 2018. Natalio Cosoy has been travelling through mining communities in the provinces of Asturias and León in northern Spain to hear how they're being transformed as the industry that sustained them vanishes.
La canción Santa Bárbara es la patrona de los mineros.
Santa Bárbara is the patron saint of the miners.
José María Prieto Álvarez, or as everyone calls him, Chemari, has been in the choir since 1978.
Y es que es el símbolo, en este momento es el símbolo de un pueblo.
The choir is a symbol of mining and a recognition of what mining meant, not just for Asturias, but also for the rest of the country, because mining provided wealth for the country. So nowadays we are the symbol of Turón, and of course that fills me with pride.
Para mí es un orgullo, claro, por supuesto.
When the mines started closing in the 90s, Chemari and many others were offered pre-pensions, a portion of their salaries paid for by a special government budget until they reached retirement age. So for them, mining is something of the past, an intense memory that must be preserved. But an hour and a half away, in the town of Siñera in León, mining and its decline is very much a thing of the present. In a cafe in Siñera, I meet Carlos, a miner with a wife and a young daughter. How do you see the future? ¿Cómo ves el futuro entonces?
El futuro, muy mal. Aquí, muy mal. En España, muy mal.
Very bad. Here in Spain, the future looks very bad.
Slowing demand for coal led his employer to suspend operations and stop paying its employees. As a young man working for an independent contractor, there's no generous early retirement deal for him. His only income is child benefits.
Porque es lamentable decir que 5 compañeros de los nuestros, de la empresa nuestra.
It's painful to say that 5 of our colleagues are eating in soup kitchens. It's terrible that we've reached this point where people have no food.
De que la gente no tenga ni para comer.
When the subsidies for mining are stopped for good in 2018, there may not be many miners left in Asturias and León. But the history and culture of mining are strong here, and somehow I suspect that Santa Bárbara Bendita, the song to the patron saint of the miners, will always be heard in these valleys.
That report by Natalia Kossoy. And that's all from us for now, but an updated version of the Global News podcast will be available for you to download later on Thursday. I'm Nick Miles. Until next time, bye-bye.